Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. George Russell was back on the podium at the Hungarian Grand Prix. That does not mean he's going to get the deal he wants from Toto Wolff. Yes, he will be a Mercedes driver next year and Max Verstappen will be a Red Bull driver, but in 2027, all bets are still off. And that means that Russell, yes, he wants a longer term contract with Mercedes to get it signed very shortly indeed, but Toto does not seem so willing to make this happen. Yes, Toto can say all he wants, that Russell is the best number one driver they could ever wish for, but Max Verstappen is definitely still on the agenda. Very much interested to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I greatly appreciate it. This I thought was kind of remarkable, looking at the 200 Grand Prix that Max Verstappen has had. It was his 200th start back, as we know, in Hungary, and it didn't go especially to plan. Neither did the Budapest race, or even Pirelli tyre test afterwards for Franco Colapinto. We just saw this yesterday. Colapinto stuck it in the wall during the Pirelli tyre test, and understandably there was lots of discussion as to whether, if Jack Doohan was still there, he could have done a better job, or what the future of Colapinto is. Now, Pirelli actually responded to this because, of course, there was some debate on, given it was a tyre test, whether this was an Alpine issue, whether this was a Colapinto issue, which it was, or whether it was a tyre issue, right? Because, you know, you're testing new tyres, it's plausible there could be an issue with the compound or something, one of the tyres blew out or something. You know, we didn't know that yesterday. The presumption was that it was Colapinto had put it into the wall of his own accord, and, well, that is what happens, based on at least what Pirelli are saying. So Alpine did a statement and say, during day 2 of Pirelli tyre testing of the Hungaro ring, Colapinto had an incident. It's a bit more of an incident, or a bit more than an incident, and Pirelli, obviously wanting to shut down some of these rumours, they made a statement, right? So Pirelli tyres will become 25mm thinner at the front and 30mm for the rears to effectively make the cars a little bit smaller than they currently are, and they maybe don't need all the grip that those tyres have to offer. Now, Pirelli say, these have been 2 useful days for making progress with the development of our compounds for next year, given that we are now entering the home straight. That's the boss, Mario Isola. We see him from time to time with the track. The Hungaro ring is a demanding track due to its many slow curves and the amount of energy that goes into the tyres on a lap that is rather short. This makes it a challenging place to test tyres, in particular for compounds that will be central to the 2026 range, which will go from C1 to C6 like we have this year. We collected a lot of data, although it was a pity that we lost some of our potential mileage today when Colapinto went off the track, even though this was not in any way linked to the tyres. So we had to get that in there and just say, like, it was nothing to do with us. The construction was fine. Colapinto binned it of his own accord, is effectively what he's getting at there. As for construction, we verified our final solutions as far as homologation is concerned ahead of the regulations coming on the 1st of September, because that's when everything has to be locked in. They've got more test sessions before December and Monza, Mugello, and then Mexico City. So that's what's going on there. But if you are a fan of Franco, it looks like he is going to keep his seat. Thomas Maher says from Planet F1 that as far as he understands, there is no immediate threat to his seat. So it's pretty fascinating what's been happening at Alpine lately, because Colapinto was told by Briatore, be fast, score points, and don't crash. And he's kind of done none of those things. But he does bring in sponsor money, and you know, has he been any worse than Doohan? You know, he's definitely not been better. I wouldn't say he's been drastically worse. He's had his moments. Doohan occasionally had his moments. If you put Paul Aron in the car, does things get any better? You know, if they put one of their other drivers back in, they've got plenty of options there at Alpine. Unlikely to work, unless maybe Valtteri Bottas is an option. There's been some talk about that lately, but given that Colapinto's got strong backing, the team is, well, let's say, at the back of the grid anyway. I mean, they're literally 10th in the championship, despite the fact that they've not got a terrible car. It's just been worse on average when it's mattered than the other teams up and down the grid. Gasly's doing an okay job, but it's still not enough to score points on anywhere near a regular basis. So keep Colapinto in the car for now probably seems like a reasonable option, but no means guaranteed that that is going to happen for too much longer. Quickly on McLaren and the rest of the grid, they are dominating the championship now to such an extent. They have 1-2s the last 4 Grand Prix in a row, and if they 1-2 the next 3, they will be champions already with 7 rounds still remaining in the season. So it's plausible that they do this. I wouldn't say it's especially likely. We know what happened in Canada could well happen again. But still, I mean, they've done it for the last several rounds. It is expected to continue. And to be fair, the drivers are pushing themselves and, one another to very intense heights at this moment. Another driver, though, who's doing a stellar job is George Russell. Has he been the best driver of the season so far? I think you can definitely argue it. We had this discussion on the channel a couple of weeks ago. I gave the nod to Max Verstappen, but I think after the last couple of weekends, you can maybe argue that it swings back the way of Russell, and these are all the podiums he's had this year, the most podiums for any driver that is not driving a McLaren. I think those guys have had 12 podiums each so far this season. Now, if let's say McLaren didn't exist. Now, I know that we used to do this in the last couple of years with Max, but okay, if Max didn't exist, what would the championship look like? If you pretend McLaren do not exist in this championship and you basically bump up all of the results, so if Russell was third this past weekend, that of course would be a victory in the Hungarian Grand Prix. This would be what the championship looked like, and this would be a mega battle. Like, this would be a mega championship. So George Russell would be leading the way on 250 points. Max would be second on 242, all to play for, and Leclerc would be third on 224. So just hypothetically, Russell would be the championship favourite. His car looks better than Max's right now. Of course, if this actually was the case, the quality of the racing would be different. Max would be in a different position because he'd actually be in a championship fight, and therefore the way that he would battle would probably be a little different. Leclerc wouldn't be out of the picture either on 224 if Ferrari can get their act together in the second half of the year. So it would be all to play for at the top of the championship. Hamilton would just be a bit further back on 165, Antonelli at 91, tied with Albon on 91 as well. Then Hülkenberg would have scored 64 points with a Sauber, which is kind of crazy. Alonso at 52, Hadjar at 51, Ocon, Stroll, Lawson, Gasly, Sainz, Bortoletto, Behrman, Tsunoda, Doohan and Colapinto would still be on a 0. But yeah, that would be the championship. It's pretty crazy actually what things would look like. But of course McLaren do exist, and one of those drivers is going to win the championship. I will say a couple of quick comments on Ferrari, how bad they've been this year. I mean, if you look at this, gap to fastest in qualifying, of course McLaren haven't been on pole every time, so their gap isn't a fat 0. Red Bull maybe helped in part by Max, but obviously helped a lot by Max, but you know what I'm saying, maybe Max is extracting more from the car than is possible, whatever you want to say, but still, they've set their car up at times, Red Bull, let's say Japan, and when they figured it out, and certainly Silverstone, to try and execute in qualifying, and their car does seem better in qualifying in general than it has in the race. They're the closest, but they're still nearly 0.4% behind McLaren on average. Mercedes are half a percentage point back, and Ferrari are even more than that, which is pretty embarrassing, right? Like, you gotta say that Ferrari, and it's not like Ferrari have bad drivers, right? Like, Lewis Hamilton had 104 pole positions, and Charles Leclerc is still arguably the fastest driver on the grid over a single lap, based on what we've seen over the last few years, and yet their car is still 4th in qualifying pace, behind a Mercedes and a Red Bull. So pretty embarrassing for Ferrari. Maybe they can figure some things out. Leclerc does say, though, he's not expecting to win, really, in the same way that Max said it. Obviously, the championship is over, but the point is, Leclerc in Hungary, he felt like, for good reason, that was his chance, right? He's had a few podiums this year. Maybe he could have actually won a race, and it probably should have happened, you might argue, if Ferrari didn't Ferrari, let's say. Now, Toto talks about the Sir, because at the end of the day, Ferrari might still finish this year second in the Constructors. And I think looking back at the season, whatever Ferrari did, yes, it's very embarrassing that Ferrari changed 99% of their car and it hasn't worked, and they're putting their drivers in difficult positions because their car is fundamentally flawed. Yeah, it's embarrassing. It's a bad season for Ferrari. It's one of the worst cars they've built in a very long time. Typical, as soon as Lewis Hamilton joins, that things don't go to plan. Who knows, maybe next year will turn around for him. The point is, though, McLaren were unbeatable. The feeling always was over the winter, if McLaren nailed it with their upgrade and their step forward, no one was going to be able to touch them. And not only have McLaren nailed it in the way that they wanted to, but they've continued to bring upgrades this season that have just made their car better and better. So, yeah, Ferrari might finish second second in the constructors, but realistically, where McLaren are, they were never going to win it. And as a result, yeah, there is criticism deserving for Vasseur, but the results at the end of the day may speak a relatively similar story. So Toto actually talks about Fred Vasseur and says, any other choice would have been really stupid. I've known Fred since we were in our 20s. I know how valuable he is as a motorsport man. I know his entrepreneurial vision and strength. Having someone like him on your team is a privilege, and we must remember how long it takes to build a successful project in F1. So Toto gives Vasseur his backing after we understand what we know. He's got that multi-year contract extension at Ferrari. Now, we also did wonder yesterday, were Ferrari playing around with anything in that Pirelli tyre test? Did they have any ideas on the car they were trying to test? They actually did. So they ran a low downforce front wing in line pretty much with what they're trying to learn for next year. So at this point, there was nothing they could really do on the SF25 that was going to help them massively for this year. Maybe they could unlock a bit more knowledge that they were lacking clearly during the weekends. But really it's about 2026, the Pirelli tyres that they were testing with the 2026 compounds, and they were running the car in a specification that is probably going to be more similar to the level of downforce expected for next year's car. Obviously around Hungary, typically you're going to be running much higher downforce, but they obviously countered that to make it more similar to what they're expecting for next year's machine. The wing was equipped with a temporary system designed to test movable flaps in line with next year's regulations. That's particularly interesting, right? We know that next year Active Aero is making a return. Now, this is concerning for some, exciting for others. The reason why Active Aero is necessary is because the engines are 50% electric, and as a result, they require a lot of power, and the batteries can't just be charged for an entire race worth of power, so they need to be recharged during the lap under braking, and of course also from the internal combustion engine. What it basically means is that if you go to a track with some downforce on your car, and you try and bomb it down the main straight, you're just going to run out of juice before you get to the end. Those were the horror stories that many were discussing, certainly Red Bull, when they first tried these cars in the sims. The solution is to run Active Aero so that basically at high speed, they will open DRS. Now, DRS no longer exists, but it will move the flaps in a way to reduce the downforce and allow the cars to actually go down the straight without too much difficulty. When they corner, then the wings will go back into higher downforce specification. They used to call it like X spec and Y spec, but they got away with that. They did away with that because it was just confusing to everyone. So that's the Active Aero we're going to have next year. The concern, of course, is I'm bombing it down the straight. I am about to brake for the corner, and it's a fast right-hander or something, right? And I need the downforce on the car. And the Active Aero fails. It doesn't work. The flaps don't deploy as they intended to. I'm off into the wall and the barrier is 180 miles an hour. So, like, this is a concern. They've got to get it right. And this is why it probably makes sense for Ferrari and other teams, if they can anyway, to test some of these electrical or hydraulic, whatever, components they're going to be using to allow this to be the case for next year. Let's talk George Russell, though, because our championship leader in the non-McLaren world, and ahead of Max Verstappen by a handful of points. Does that mean he's getting the contract he wants at Mercedes? Well, maybe, but also maybe not. Mercedes believe they could potentially fight with McLaren at some Grand Prix from now to the end of the year. The one concern for the team is still that, yeah, maybe the car has improved somewhat over the last round, but it regressed substantially because they got the rear suspension change wrong. And Toto was actually very critical of his own team's engineers, maybe more so than you would normally expect, but Toto says we've given our drivers a more stable platform, their increased confidence was reflected in their lap times, Russell was close to pole, Antonelli did 50 laps on one set of tyres, defending 10th place. We rebuilt the car to its pre-Imola state and made it better. That shouldn't happen, that an upgrade can mess everything up like that. With all the smart people on the team, all the simulations, all the infrastructure we have, you don't expect a car architecture to confuse you like that. We tried to solve one problem and it made something else significantly worse. That has now been fixed, but what has not been fixed is Toto's ego maybe over this issue, and also the confidence of the team. It's something that in the final year of the regulations, you make a substantial architecture change to the rear suspension of your car. You're probably expecting at that point you know what it's going to do. But again, Mercedes found out that actually no, it didn't. And it's not like it didn't and they knew it and they took it off immediately. They thought it was working as intended because it worked in Canada before they then realized it didn't. So Look, if I'm Max, I'm still looking at Mercedes and saying, do they really know what's going on in this era? But next era, in 2026, the ground effect is still going to be relevant, but the Venturi tunnels are going to disappear and it's going to be far less of an impactful feature on the car. So maybe Mercedes are going to be back, and James Allison, who's probably been working fully on 2026 for some time, is going to cook up another masterpiece. Now, what does it mean for the drivers? Antonelli's not going anywhere, as we know. He's getting a bit more confidence now. Hungary was not bad, apart from qualifying. His pace was actually pretty strong during the Grand Prix, and Russell's been excellent. Nobody's going to deny that this season. Toto even goes as far to say that we could not wish for a better number one driver. Now, I will agree that I don't think there is any driver on the planet, maybe, or certainly no driver on the grid, apart from obviously Hamilton, who led the way for a long time, who would be a better number one driver for Mercedes as a cultural entity. Like, Russell fits Mercedes so well, right? Like, the way that, I don't know, just his personality, in my opinion, he's like a great Mercedes frontman. He fits their mold very, very well, and he's an excellent driver, right? Nobody is denying that at this point. But is he the best possible driver available on the market? He's very close to it, but Max Verstappen is still a reigning four-time world champion. So this is why things get very interesting when it comes to this period. Okay, yes, Max has confirmed he's going to be staying at Red Bull for 2026, but nothing after that. And we also don't exactly know under what terms Max is staying. We do understand that Max's contract clause, the performance clause, that allowed him to get out of the contract if he was fourth in the championship after this Grand Prix, which of course he is not. Russell gave it a good go to catch him up this race, but in the end, Max is still a handful of points ahead of George, about a dozen or so after Hungary, and as a result, he cannot leave his Red Bull contract and he will stay. But the rumour has it that he had basically made that decision anyway, that he felt it makes more sense to stay at Red Bull for next year just so he can see the lay of the land and then decide what he wants to do. The other rumour was that Red Bull told Max, look, please stay, and if you do stay, you can do whatever the hell you want in 2027. We're not going to hold you to anything. If you want to leave, you can leave. We're going to try and prove to you that this is the place to be. And that was a rumour. I don't know if that's actually true or not, what the contract will end up saying. But the point is that Max is making the decisions that he's making because he thinks that given the circumstances, and also given the potential €100 million buyout that Mercedes would have to pay for him to get him right now, it makes more sense for both parties to stay put for the time being. But in 27, of course, as I said at the start of the video, all bets are very much off. And that's why when Russell says, we saw the quote yesterday, Russell says, oh, well, I'm not expecting a new contract by the end of the summer break. I want to take some time away just to chill out, get away from the sport, relax a bit. It's like, okay, I get that. He's already on his yacht. I'm sure having a good time. But he's got, 2-3 weeks off. You could imagine that he could go to Toto's yacht and sit down for about half an hour and sign a contract. That probably wouldn't take too much of an enjoyment out of the summer. And yeah, Toto said that Russell is going to sleep well, or whatever he said, over the summer break. Basically saying, yeah, he's going to be at Mercedes. No one is expecting otherwise. The big question is, though, under what terms will he stay at Mercedes? Because we know, or we could well imagine, that Russell would want a longer-term deal with the team. He would want more money, more than the €30 million a year, which is substantial, but, there was a rumour that he would try and push for more than that, given that some of the, Max Lewis, they're on 60, 70, 80, 100, whatever, something in that kind of ballpark. So Russell would probably either push for more money or for a longer contract relationship with the team. But again, Toto is not exactly rushing to put pen to paper, right? And maybe they don't need to. Russell knows he's going to be there next year. Toto knows that George is going to be there next year. He knows he's going to sign him back again. But under what terms? Is it going to be a 2-year deal? Is it going to be a 1-year deal with a 1-year extension? What does that look like? Because we know that Max is potentially available and Toto may well potentially want him. So that relationship is still pretty interesting, especially when Russell was quite clear during the last couple of weeks that it has been kind of tumultuous. He was always confident he wasn't going anywhere, but George did say to the press that, yeah, it's not been easy for me and Kimi seeing the Max conversations basically swirling around the team and knowing that things could change in a heartbeat. Max also is very clear that he's not winning a race for the rest of the season with Red Bull. Maybe he will, but he's not expecting to anyway. And on current evidence, will he be expecting much from next year? Probably not, as it stands. So that's why Toto's decision is very challenging, to be honest. Like, I always was of the opinion that keeping George for next year was the thing to do. And I'll back that, and it seems that that's what they are going to do. But for 2027, I mean, wow, like, you've got to wonder what makes the most sense of both parties, because I can imagine Max being very keen to go to Mercedes in 2027, but if Russell's still doing a stellar job, then maybe it could even be Antonelli on the chopping block, just to throw something out there. Let's say next year it's a Mercedes-Ferrari battle for the championship, or it's a Mercedes-McLaren battle for the championship, and maybe George wins the drivers, but they don't win the constructors because Antonelli just wasn't quite strong enough, right? Still learning the sport. Maybe that's enough for them to back him, but, let's say hypothetically, it looks like they're going to lose out the constructors and not get to where Mercedes want to be because of it. Maybe there's an argument to say, well, yeah, Lando, Oscar, it's a nice lineup. Charles Lewis, it's a nice lineup, but, have you thought about George, Max, right? Like, that could be what Toto brings to the table. So it's a decision that they will have to make. I'm sure that it's something that they will be thinking about over this period, but very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.